On the afternoon of 7th October 1966, the sea wind off Newport pushed against the windows of Rough Point, Doris Duke's vast stone house on Bellevue Avenue. In the long drawing room, carnations and roses wait in buckets. A low table is already crowded with porcelain bowls. Duke, then 53, leans over one of them, shifting stems until the curve of a branch pleases her eye. For decades, society pages have called her the richest girl in the world, an heiress who collects houses, paintings, and gardens with equal appetite. Outside the gates, decorator and close friend Eduardo Tirella checks the time. They're due to leave soon. Inside, a staff member notes in a log that Miss Duke has requested more flowers. Years later, police reports and a brief New York Times notice will record that Tirella died that day when a car driven by Doris Duke crashed through those same gates and into a tree. His death ruled accidental. The camera lingers on the finished arrangement, flawless, perfectly balanced, and unable to explain what it cost to create such beauty. On 22nd November 1912, in a Manhattan hospital, a nurse records the birth of a daughter to tobacco magnate James Buchanan, Duke, and his wife, Nanaline Holt Inman, Duke. The infant arrives into a world already counting her fortune. Newspapers quickly christen her the richest baby in the world, a child whose inheritance from American tobacco and Duke power will soon be measured in tens of millions of dollars. The phrase appears in print before Doris is old enough to read it, establishing a public identity she will spend her life both inhabiting and resisting. By 1915, at Duke Farms in Hillsborough Township, New Jersey, the little girl wandered beneath glass roofs that shelter orchids and palms through northern winters. Her father has transformed more than 2,000 acres into an estate of conservatories, fountains, and formal gardens, a monument to what industrial wealth can impose upon the landscape. Photographs from this period show Doris in white dresses and wide hats, small against stone balustrades, dwarfed by the hothouse architecture her father has constructed as casually as other men might plant a vegetable garden. Governments and nurses keep pace at discreet distances, their presence documented in household employment records. The child learns early that servants handle coats and door handles. Her role is to move through spaces others prepare, to touch flowers arranged by gardeners, to offer shy handshakes when visitors come, and then retreat to rooms where adults make decisions about her day. Her world seems limitless in size. The conservatories stretch for what must feel like miles to small legs. The lakes reflect endless sky. Yet her movements within it are carefully circumscribed. She may wander the gardens, but always under watch. She may ask questions, but the answers are often deflected or simplified. James B. Duke, who built his fortune by consolidating the tobacco industry into the American Tobacco Company Trust before diversifying into hydroelectric power, approaches fatherhood as he approached business, with systematic attention to infrastructure and legacy. Duke Farms is not merely a home, but a demonstration of possibility, a landscape engineered to showcase what can be achieved when capital meets will. For Doris, growing up within this engineered Eden, the lesson is implicit. Beauty requires control, order requires wealth, and both are normal conditions of existence. From the beginning, her wealth is described as a marvel, newspapers treating her inheritance as a kind of fairy tale, a story of abundance without complication. The language of marvel, the wonder, the envy, the fascination will prove difficult to escape. Even as an adult, even after tragedy and scandal, she will remain the richest girl in public imagination, the adjective forever outweighing any other identity she might claim. As she learns to place flowers in vases for her father's table, small hands arranging stems under a governess's approving eye, Doris is also learning how beauty can distract from questions of power, how a perfect arrangement can occupy the eye while larger mechanisms operate unseen. On 10th October 1925, James B. Duke died at his New York City residence. His final illness brief and his passing extensively covered in newspapers that had long tracked his business empire. Within weeks, the New York Times reports that his estate, conservatively valued between $60 and $100 million, though some estimates run higher, has been left largely to his widow Nanaline and his 13-year-old daughter Doris. The will also established the Duke Endowment, a charitable foundation that will eventually channel millions into North Carolina institutions, including what will become Duke University. At Duke Farms that winter, legal papers spread across polished library desks. The estate proves complex. Because of ambiguities in the will's language regarding certain real estate holdings, properties including the grand townhouse at 1 East 78th Street in Manhattan risk being sold to settle accounts. The executors, Nanaline among them, disagree on interpretation. Under the guidance of the family's legal team, Doris, still in her early teens and attending school, becomes the named plaintiff in a lawsuit to prevent the liquidation of key properties. Court records from 1926 show her successfully challenging her mother and other executors to preserve the real estate portfolio intact, a legal maneuver that ensures she will inherit not just liquid assets, but the physical infrastructure of her father's empire. The lawsuit, technical and arcane in its particulars, marks a threshold. For many Gilded Age heirs, adulthood began not with gainful employment or romantic attachment, but with a lawyer's brief, a courtroom appearance, an oath sworn on documents whose implications would take years to fully understand. At 13, Doris becomes both ward and litigant, protected by wealth while simultaneously deployed as its instrument. The first significant decision bearing her name is conducted in legal language others draft for her, a pattern that will recur throughout her life. Power exercised through intermediaries, will express through counsel, autonomy mediated by the very structures meant to preserve it. In family photographs from this period, preserved in archives and later published in biographical accounts, Doris stands slightly apart from Nanaline at social functions. She has inherited her father's height and is already tall for her age, her expression composed in the way children learn when cameras become routine rather than novel. The loss of her father, the sudden weight of inheritance, the transformation from child to legal entity, none of this appears in the photographic record, which shows only a well-dressed young woman whose bearing suggests she has been raised to carry burdens gracefully, whether she chose them or not. She has inherited not only money, but responsibility, for foundations whose boards will meet in her name, for land whose management requires constant attention, for a public image that newspapers have already decided matters to readers who will never meet her. When she is presented to society a few years later, it will be at Rough Point, the Newport mansion her father purchased in 1922 to match the scale of his fortune, a house built to accommodate the inheritance she is only beginning to understand. In the summer of 1930, sea light pours through the tall windows of Rough Point, the Tudor Gothic mansion on Newport's Bellevue Avenue that has been part of the Duke holdings for 8 years. The house, originally designed by the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns for Frederick W. Vanderbilt in the 1890s and later acquired by James B. Duke, rises from the rocky coast with the solidity of a small fortress, its stone walls and leaded windows speaking a language of permanence and tradition foreign to the newer American fortunes it now serves. At 18, Doris is presented as a debutante here, photographed ascending the grand staircase beneath stained glass windows that filter Atlantic light into jewel tones. Contemporary accounts in society columns note her unusual height. She stands around 6 feet, towering over many of the young men who will dance with her, and inevitably, repeatedly, the fortune she controls. Columnists reach for the familiar phrase, "the richest girl in the world," as if her identity requires this constant monetary anchoring, as if readers might forget who she is without the reminder of what she owns. The ball follows familiar Newport choreography, rituals established over decades of summer seasons when wealthy families from New York and Philadelphia retreated to coastal estates. Orchestras play in the Great Hall. Champagne circulates on silver trays carried by uniformed staff. Dancing continues on polished floors until the small hours. The floral arrangements, recorded in guests' recollections and visible in surviving photographs, are lavish, even by Newport standards. Gardeners and florists have spent days filling rooms with roses and lilies, creating the abundant, seemingly effortless beauty that actually requires extensive planning and labor. Doris, wearing white as tradition dictates for debutantes, moves through the crowd as hostess in training, a role her mother has been grooming her for since childhood. She knows, because she has been taught, that as much scrutiny falls on her manners as on her diamonds, that every gesture will be noted and discussed, that she represents not merely herself but the Duke fortune and all it signifies about American wealth's arrival at social maturity. The evening is both celebration and examination, a public demonstration that she has mastered the codes and protocols that separate the merely rich from the socially accomplished. In earlier Gilded Age decades, such evenings had often led directly to titled marriages abroad. American heiresses like Consuelo Vanderbilt and Jenny Jerome trading fortunes for European aristocratic names in transactions that newspapers covered like diplomatic treaties. By 1930, the worst of the dollar princess era had passed. The market for titles having cooled somewhat after the First World War decimated European aristocracy and complicated transatlantic social dynamics. Yet the expectation that a great heiress should marry strategically remains, that her choice of husband will reflect not merely personal affection, but family ambition, financial consolidation, and social positioning. What the photographers do not capture, what the society columns cannot report, is how it feels to be 18 and always, everywhere, defined by inheritance, to have one's identity so completely conflated with wealth that even celebration becomes a kind of inventory. The flowers arranged throughout Rough Point that evening are beautiful. They are also expensive, impressive, strategic, chosen to demonstrate taste and resources, to create an atmosphere of cultivated abundance. Like so much in Doris's life, they serve purposes beyond their immediate beauty. Within 5 years, she will exchange Rough Point's ballroom for embassy reception lines in Canada and France, discovering that marriage, too, can be another form of public performance, another stage on which to demonstrate the grace expected of someone with her particular burden of fortune. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Doris Duke's education unfolds in private rooms at Duke Farms and the New York townhouse rather than in institutional classrooms. Biographical accounts note that she had personal servants and private tutors rather than the traditional school experience that might have brought her into daily contact with peers from families of lesser wealth. The curriculum is customized, shaped by her mother's vision of what an heiress should know and be able to do, by tutors hired to impart specific skills, by the assumption that her future will not require her to earn a living but will demand extensive social competence. Mornings might begin with a French lesson at a polished desk, the scratch of a fountain pen mixing with the distant hiss of steam radiators warming the high-ceilinged rooms against New Jersey winters. She learns to read and write in French fluently, mastering grammar and vocabulary that will allow her to move comfortably in European settings, to converse with aristocrats and diplomats who expect Americans to demonstrate cultural sophistication beyond mere wealth. Afternoon rides on estate horses or tennis on private courts follow, physical activities supervised by staff trained to ensure both safety and proper form. Later, showing an independence uncommon in her background, she will study jazz piano, an instrument and genre that suggest interests beyond the classical repertoire her tutors might have preferred. The choice hints at a tension between the woman she is being trained to become and the one she might wish to be, between the formal elegance expected of a Duke heiress and the more democratic improvisational spirit of American jazz culture. Etiquette arrives not as a discrete subject, but as a constant atmosphere, how to write letters of thanks that strike the correct balance between warmth and formality, how to receive guests without appearing either too eager or too distant, how to move through a room without seeming to hurry, without drawing attention to the body's mechanics, how to make conversation that engages without revealing too much. All of this is modeled by her mother and reinforced by household rules so pervasive they become invisible, the water in which she swims. Her father's death when she was 13 and her mother's social ambitions mean that from an early age, Doris understands herself as a representative of the Duke fortune, a living emblem of tobacco and hydroelectric wealth. The curriculum blends grammar and geography with an unspoken but crucial major in discretion. in learning what can be said and what must remain private, in calibrating public presentation to protect private reality. Unlike many Gilded Age girls who were explicitly trained for aristocratic marriage, sent to European finishing schools, introduced to titled families through maternal networks, Doris is trained for something vaguer and more open-ended: stewardship of an empire she did not build, and a life that must appear enviable, even when it is not. The isolation of this education, the absence of classrooms filled with peers, of teachers accountable to institutions rather than to her mother, of the routine social testing that comes from daily interaction with equals, will shape her lifelong ambivalence about intimacy and trust. When tragedy strikes at rough point decades later, when a man she has worked closely with for years lies dead and newspapers speculate about what happened, the training in Nuan's poise and privacy will serve her well, allowing her to maintain composure under intense scrutiny. Whether that training serves truth or merely the appearance of propriety is a question the documentary cannot definitively answer. By the mid-1930s, transatlantic ocean liners and diplomatic receptions replaced tutored classrooms as settings for Doris Duke's continuing education. After her marriage on 13 February 1935 to James H.R. Cromwell, a man 12 years her senior, son of the prominent socialite Eva Stotesbury, and himself an aspiring politician, she travels widely, her movements tracked by society pages, fascinated by where great wealth chooses to go and what it chooses to do. When Cromwell is appointed United States Ambassador to Canada in 1940, a position his political connections and his wife's financial support helped secure, Doris finds herself in official receiving lines, attending state dinners, performing the ceremonial duties of diplomatic life. Photographs from this period show her in elegant gowns at embassy functions, holding the small bouquets or wearing the corsages that protocol sometimes requires. The floral motif that began as childhood play at Duke Farms now accompanying her as diplomatic adornment, part of the costume of official femininity. During World War II, she volunteered for a servicemen's canteen in Cairo, Egypt, earning the symbolic salary of $1 a year, a gesture that acknowledges the voluntary nature of her contribution while framing her war work as labor rather than mere charity. In 1945, she briefly worked as a foreign correspondent for the International News Service, filing dispatches that demonstrate familiarity with global politics and competent journalistic instinct. Letters and articles from this period, preserved in news archives, show a woman fluent in French and attuned to diplomatic undercurrents, capable of asking sharp questions and synthesizing complex information. Yet celebrity shadows these efforts. No matter how seriously she approaches war work or journalism, newspapers continue to frame her as a glamorous heiress dabbling in serious matters, unable or unwilling to see beyond the fortune to the person attempting to find purpose within and despite it. The careful way she writes her own copy, avoiding self-revelation, emphasizing facts over personality, maintaining the professional distance that journalism demands, mirrors the way she has learned to move through public spaces, always aware that someone is watching, always conscious that her wealth precedes and often overwhelms any other identity she might claim. Through all these travels, through embassy postings and war zones and journalistic assignments, she continues to arrange flowers wherever she lives, in rented apartments in Paris, in temporary quarters in Cairo, in hotel rooms and diplomatic residences. It is a ritual that photographs easily, an activity that newspapers can describe as appropriately feminine and refined, evidence that despite her unusual height and wealth and independence, she retains the domestic sensibilities expected of women of her class. But it is also, perhaps, something more private, a way of managing, however briefly, the immediate landscape in front of her, of creating small moments of order and beauty in a life whose larger shape is constantly being interpreted, discussed, and judged by observers who know her fortune far better than they know her. Her only child, a daughter named Arden, is born prematurely in Honolulu on 1st July 1940 and dies within hours. The loss documented in brief, stark newspaper notices that respect the family's grief while noting it for the public record. The death is rarely mentioned in later biographical accounts of Doris's life, a silence that may reflect either privacy preferences or the documentary difficulty of accessing internal grief. What remains is the fact: a child lost, a mother's hopes ended almost before they began, another piece of the story of privilege that newspapers rarely told, the cost that exists beyond the catalog of mansions and jewels. Travel, for Doris Duke, does not dismantle privilege. It teaches her how portable that privilege is, how it travels with her in the form of bank accounts and social connections and the immediate deference that great wealth commands. It also teaches her how difficult it is to set down, to move through the world as someone other than the richest girl, to be seen for qualities that exist independent of inheritance. When her marriage to Cromwell dissolves in divorce in 1943, she discovers that even divorce becomes a kind of public theater for a woman of her fortune, the dissolution of intimacy conducted partly in courtrooms and gossip columns, privacy a commodity increasingly difficult to purchase no matter how much money one has. On 13th of February 1935, in a ceremony that drew significant society page coverage, Doris Duke married James H.R. Cromwell in New York. The marriage represents, at least initially, what such unions were meant to be in the world they inhabit: a consolidation of social position, a partnership between established names, a union that combines her fortune with his political ambitions. When Cromwell receives his ambassadorship to Canada in 1940, newspapers note that his wife's financial backing has likely smoothed the path, that in the calculus of diplomatic appointments, access to Duke money represents a certain kind of asset to the administration that rewards it with position. Their only child, a daughter named Arden, arrives too early on 1st July 1940 in Honolulu, her brief life measured in hours rather than days, her death noted in newspaper obituaries with the factual restraint expected when reporting on prominent families' private griefs. The loss, devastating in ways that documentary evidence cannot fully capture, marks Doris in ways that will show only obliquely in later years. In her lifelong support for medical research and child health causes, in the particular care she will take with gardens and growing things, in absences that biographers note but cannot interpret with certainty. The marriage ended in divorce in 1943, the legal proceedings conducted with the discretion that wealth can purchase but generating newspaper coverage nonetheless, society pages tracking the dissolution with the same attention they had devoted to the wedding 8 years earlier. Whatever private disappointments or incompatibilities led to the split, the public record shows only the formal conclusion: a marriage that began with social promise, ending in documented separation, another transaction completed. 4 years later, on 1st September 1947 in Paris, Doris marries Porfirio Rubirosa, Dominican diplomat, champion polo player, racing driver, and international figure whose previous wives have included French actress Danielle Darrieux, and who will later marry Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress. The marriage generates extensive press coverage, fascinated by the pairing of the famously private American heiress with the gregarious, visible Rubirosa. According to multiple biographical sources, Doris reportedly pays Darrieux a substantial sum to expedite her divorce from Rubirosa, a transaction that underscores how even romantic entanglements in this world are mediated by money, how desire itself can be negotiated through financial instruments, how intimacy and commerce remain inextricably tangled at these altitudes of wealth. The marriage to Rubirosa lasted barely a year, ending in divorce in 1948, though they reportedly remained on friendly terms afterward, occasionally seen together at social functions in Europe. In photographs from these years of marriage and divorce, Doris appears in couture gowns at embassy receptions and society balls, holding small bouquets or wearing corsages pinned to elegant dresses. The floral motif, once a child's pleasure at Duke Farms, has become an adornment and symbol, part of the costume of diplomatic and social femininity that she wears when public visibility requires it. For Doris Duke, marriage does not function as the single defining alliance it did in earlier Gilded Age narratives of women like Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose life was effectively shaped by her forced union with the Duke of Marlborough. Instead, marriage becomes one arena among many: philanthropy, art collecting, travel, and eventually preservation work, in which she experiments with intimacy under the constant glare of wealth, testing what kinds of partnership might be possible for someone whose fortune makes her simultaneously attractive and suspect, desirable and dangerous. Neither marriage produces the lasting partnership or the children that might have anchored her in conventional domestic narratives. What they produce instead is experience, and perhaps a clearer understanding of how difficult it is to separate affection from aspiration when one party arrives at the altar with tens of millions of dollars. By the time she returns to Rough Point as its primary mistress in the late 1950s, she is no longer the ingenue debutante of 1930, but a woman twice divorced, childless, experienced in the ways that wealth both enables and complicates human connection, increasingly protective of the privacy that public fascination with her fortune makes perpetually elusive. In 1957, Doris Duke reestablishes Rough Point as her primary Newport residence, after years in which her mother Nanaline had occupied the house. Nanaline has died, and Doris, now in her 40s, begins to transform the mansion according to her own eclectic tastes, accumulated over decades of travel and collecting. The house, originally designed by Peabody and Stearns in the 1890s and remodeled by architect Horace Trumbauer for the Dukes in the 1920s, now reflects what later museum materials will describe as her 30-year shopping spree. Tapestries from Europe, Islamic art from the Middle East, Chinese porcelains, French and English furniture, paintings by European masters. Tour materials and later exhibition texts note that she did much of the decorating herself, personally selecting antiques in shops and auction houses, arranging rooms with the same attention to detail she brought to flower arrangements, creating interiors that blend historical periods and cultural sources with confident disregard for conventional decorator rules. In photographs taken before her death, preserved now in the House Museum's archives, one sees not only grand formal spaces, but also intimate vignettes. A low table positioned by tall windows to capture ocean light, filled with orchids in porcelain containers. A bowl of cut flowers framing the Atlantic view. Smaller arrangements placed throughout the house with care that suggest personal attention rather than staff routine. Yet, even as she retreats from public life, consistently refusing interviews, dodging photographers, cultivating a reputation for reclusiveness that only increases public fascination, Rough Point places her back within a tradition of Newport spectacle she might prefer to escape. Tourists walking the cliff walk below can glimpse the house's stone walls rising from the rocks. Locals trade stories about the reclusive heiress and her unusual household, including the camels she reportedly kept on the lawn, exotic animals maintained as casually as other people might keep dogs, another expression of wealth's ability to import anything, make anywhere, into anywhere else. The house functions as both fortress and stage set, allowing Doris to curate which parts of her life the outside world can see. The carefully arranged public rooms speak a language of refinement and taste. What happens in private quarters, in the everyday rhythms of a house staffed by employees whose relationship to their employer blurs lines between professional service and personal intimacy, remains largely hidden. Letters and later interviews with former staff members suggest a household in which boundaries were often unclear, in which the very wealth that should have enforced clear hierarchies instead created zones of ambiguity, where servants became confidants and companions occupied roles somewhere between friend and employee. Among these companions, Eduardo Tirella stands out, hired sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s as a decorator and art curator. He became increasingly central to Doris's aesthetic projects, helping to oversee her collections, advising on acquisitions, assisting with the arrangement and display of the thousands of objects she has accumulated across decades of collecting. For roughly a decade, he is among her closest collaborators. His taste and judgment trusted in ways that few others achieve. That balance between curator and friend, employee and confidant, will shatter in October 1966 when an afternoon drive ends at the estate gates with consequences that remain contested more than 50 years later, when the careful arrangements Doris has made, both aesthetic and social, will fail to protect her from questions about what happened when one life ended and another continued. By early October 1966, Eduardo Tirella had been working closely with Doris Duke for nearly a decade, helping to shape the aesthetic of Rough Point and her other properties, overseeing art acquisitions, managing the presentation of collections worth millions. Staff members later describe him as talented, creative, indispensable, one of the few people whose opinion Doris genuinely valued, whose taste she trusted enough to grant significant autonomy over decisions that shaped her living spaces. On 6th of October 1966, Tirella flew to Newport specifically to tell Doris that he intended to leave her employ. Friends later recount to investigators and journalists that he has been offered promising opportunities in Hollywood, potential work in production design that represents both career advancement and escape from the somewhat circumscribed role of managing an heiress's collections. They also report that he feared her reaction, worried that she would be furious at his departure, anxious about how to frame his exit from a position that has been both professionally rewarding and personally complicated. The next afternoon, 7th of October, staff at Rough Point hear raised voices before Doris and Eduardo leave together in a rented Dodge Polaris station wagon, a large vehicle borrowed for the occasion. What was said during that argument, if argument it was, remains known only to one living person. Tirella will not survive the day to offer his account. Later, police reports and witness statements will attempt to reconstruct those final hours, but the interior emotional truth, what each person wanted, what they said to each other, what transpired in the car before it reached the gates, exists beyond the reach of documentary evidence. In these final hours, we can imagine, based on house archives and surviving photographs, rooms still filled with the objects they chose and arranged together. Renaissance paintings hanging in the Great Hall, tapestries positioned to catch particular light, Islamic tiles creating patterns on walls, carefully placed vases of flowers on tables throughout the house. The collaboration that shaped those spaces is ending. The specific aesthetic vision they had built together over a decade is about to fracture. One party wishes to leave, the other, accustomed to controlling her environment through wealth and will, must confront the limits of what money can compel or retain. For someone in Doris Duke's position, surrounded from birth by staff and servants whose livelihoods depend on her satisfaction, the departure of a valued employee might register as something more personal than mere professional transition, as abandonment, even betrayal. For someone in Tirella's position, talented and ambitious but working always in service to another's vision and at another's pleasure, the Hollywood opportunity might represent not just career advancement but self-determination, the chance to create rather than merely curate, to receive credit for work rather than facilitate someone else's collecting. In a world where staff and companions were often transient, hired, dismissed, moving on to other positions or other lives, Tirella had been unusually central, unusually constant. His decision to leave marks one of those rare moments when someone close to Doris attempts to step outside her orbit, to assert independence from the gravitational pull of her wealth and will. Minutes later, at the estate gates on Bellevue Avenue, that orbit will become the subject of police reports and decades of speculation. A private relationship suddenly exposed to public scrutiny. A death that raises questions that neither official investigations nor subsequent journalism can fully resolve. On the late afternoon of 7 October 1966, the rented Dodge Polaris station wagon carrying Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella rolled slowly toward the iron gates of Rough Point on Bellevue Avenue. According to Duke's own statement given to police shortly after the incident and later summarized in police reports and press accounts, Tirella stops the car near the gates, steps out to open them manually, as was apparently their custom, the gates requiring someone to physically push them open, and leaves the engine running. She says she slides from the passenger seat into the driver's seat to pull the car forward through the opening gates. Instead of applying the brake as intended, she claims, her foot hits the accelerator. The heavy station wagon surges forward with sudden, terrible force. It strikes Tirella, who is still standing between the open gates. The vehicle knocks down sections of the ornate ironwork, crashes through the gateway and comes to rest only when it collides with a tree on Bellevue Avenue, the impact finally stopping its momentum. Tirella is found in the road with fatal injuries, crushed by the vehicle, according to the medical examiner's later report. He is transported to Newport Hospital, where he is pronounced dead. He is 42 years old. A brief notice in the New York Times, published days later, reports the death and notes that Rhode Island authorities have ruled it accidental, a tragic mistake by an inexperienced driver who confused pedals in a moment of panic. Inside Rough Point, the floral arrangements Doris had been working on earlier that day remain undisturbed, perfect blooms in porcelain vases, beauty carefully calibrated and placed. In photographs taken years later, when the house opens as a museum, the gates appear intact, repaired or replaced after the accident, the lawns immaculate, no visible trace of what happened that October afternoon. The physical evidence of the crash, bent metal, broken stone, blood on the pavement, the specific pattern of damage to car and gates and human body exists now only in police photographs filed in Newport archives and in the memories of first responders and witnesses who heard the impact, saw the aftermath, tried to reconstruct from wreckage and testimony what had transpired in those final seconds before Tirella died. The flawless arrangement on the drawing room table cannot explain what it cost to create such beauty. Neither can it explain what happened at the gates, whether negligence or something darker, whether a confused foot or a deliberate act, whether an accident or the exercise of power that knows itself beyond meaningful consequence. The flowers simply sit, stems precisely angled, colors balanced, an aesthetic achievement that exists in a different register than the questions accumulating outside the estate walls. Within hours, the machinery of law and influence will begin to shape the narrative of what happened at those gates to determine whether this death requires investigation or can be quickly categorized, filed, and closed. The speed of that process, the conclusions reached before all evidence has been fully examined, will later become the source of persistent questions about whether wealth purchased not just houses and art, but also the official version of how a man died. In the days following the crash, Newport police conduct what they later characterize as a thorough investigation, interviewing witnesses, examining the vehicle, reviewing Doris Duke's account of events. They conclude quickly that Tirella's death was an accident, consistent with Duke's statement that she mistakenly hit the accelerator instead of the brake, a common enough error, particularly for an inexperienced driver, particularly in a moment of stress or confusion. The case is closed. No criminal charges are filed. The official determination: accidental death. Tirella's family, 8 siblings in New Jersey, a close-knit Italian-American family who had watched Eduardo build a successful career in design and were expecting him to move on to greater opportunities. In Hollywood, are not satisfied with this conclusion. They question how the physical evidence aligns with the stated sequence of events, why the investigation concluded so swiftly, whether all relevant questions were asked and answered. Unable to compel criminal charges, they pursue the avenue available to them, a civil wrongful death lawsuit filed against Doris Duke. The civil trial, conducted several years after the accident, hears testimony from witnesses, examines technical evidence about the car's condition and the force required to cause the observed damage, considers the spatial relationships between gates, vehicle, and victim. The jury finds Doris Duke negligent in Tirella's death and orders her to pay damages to his family. The original award is reduced on appeal, a common outcome in civil cases, though one that the family experiences as further injustice. They ultimately receive $75,000, a sum that in other contexts might seem substantial, but that represents a tiny fraction of Duke's fortune, a rounding error in an estate measured in hundreds of millions. The trial transcript, which should provide the most complete record of evidence and testimony, has partially disappeared from official archives, some portions missing, others misfiled, the documentary record incomplete in ways that later investigators find suspicious. What remains suggests that the physical evidence may not have aligned as neatly with the initial police conclusions as the quick closure might suggest, that questions raised by the family's attorneys about speed, force, and sequence of events were not easily answered. In the decades since, Investigative journalists such as Peter Lance have re-examined the case, publishing accounts in Vanity Fair and other outlets that raise the possibility of a cover-up influenced by Duke's wealth and her subsequent philanthropy in Newport. They note the speed of the initial police determination, the missing trial documents, the relatively light civil penalty, the absence of criminal charges. They compile testimony from witnesses who recall details that don't quite fit the official narrative, from staff members who describe Duke's anger at Torella's plan to leave, from experts who question whether the described accident could produce the observed damage. The official record, however, still lists Eduardo Torella's death as accidental. No criminal charges were ever filed. The civil judgment has been satisfied. The case, in legal terms, is closed. What remains open are the questions that documentation cannot answer. What happened in those final seconds before the car surged forward? What was in Doris Duke's mind and heart? Whether this was truly an accident or whether something else occurred that October afternoon. Something darker and more complicated than pedal confusion. Something that wealth and influence helped to obscure. The historian's task is not to pronounce a verdict where courts and juries have already spoken, but to trace how privilege intersects with process, how wealth shapes which stories get told and which questions remain unanswered, and how the official version of events sometimes sits uncomfortably alongside persistent doubt. In 1968, 2 years after Eduardo Torella's death, Doris Duke established the Newport Restoration Foundation, NRF, dedicating millions of dollars to the rescue and restoration of colonial-era buildings throughout the city. The foundation began acquiring and rehabilitating 18th-century houses, modest structures, many of them built by craftsmen and merchants long before the Gilded Age mansions that made Newport synonymous with extreme wealth. Today, the NRF owns and maintains more than 80 historic properties, one of the largest such collections in the United States, a preservation achievement that has fundamentally shaped Newport's historic character and economic base. She also funds significant repairs to the Cliff Walk, the public path that runs along the rocky coast past Rough Point and other estates, ensuring that this democratic amenity, where ordinary citizens can walk and view the ocean that wealthy families claim as their private vista, remains accessible and safe. She donated $10,000 to Newport Hospital, the same institution that treated her after the 1966 accident, and where Eduardo Torella was pronounced dead, a gift noted in contemporary news coverage as generous civic support. These acts are entirely consistent with Doris Duke's broader pattern of philanthropy, which expanded throughout her life to encompass major foundations in the arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and child health. By the time of her death in 1993, she will have created institutional structures that continue to distribute millions annually, supporting causes she cared about with a systematicness that suggests genuine commitment rather than mere noblesse oblige. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation remains one of the largest private foundations in the United States, its endowment ensuring that her priorities outlive her by decades. In Newport, however, oral histories and local newspaper articles from the years following Torella's death record a more complicated perception of these contributions. Some locals celebrate Duke as a far-sighted benefactor who saved buildings that might otherwise have been demolished, who invested in preservation when others saw only profit in development, who used her wealth to protect the city's architectural heritage. Others, particularly those who knew Torella or his family, perceived the philanthropy as at least partly strategic, a way to soften civic memory of the 1966 incident, to ensure that when Newport residents thought of Doris Duke, they thought first of restored colonial houses, rather than unanswered questions about a decorator's death. Preservation plaques throughout the city's historic district note NRF ownership and Duke's generosity. Museum tours celebrate her vision and support. The physical landscape of Newport bears her mark in ways that few individuals can claim. Her money having literally preserved the built environment that defines the city's identity. Yet for some, including members of Torella's family, who continue to believe that justice was never fully served, The flowers blooming in Rough Point's gardens and the restored houses bearing foundation plaques cannot erase the questions that official investigations decline to answer fully, cannot compensate for a life that ended at 42, cannot resolve the ambiguity about what happened when wealth and mortality collided at an estate gate. Philanthropy, the documentary suggests, without resolving, can be both genuine commitment and a form of social negotiation, both authentic generosity and strategic self-preservation. For Doris Duke, whose identity fused generosity with secrecy, whose life was shaped by the contradictions inherent in being both public figure and intensely private person, the line between authentic care and self-protective giving remains difficult to draw. As Old Newport resets its facades with Duke Foundation support, Doris herself moves toward the final chapter of her life, one defined less by society parties and public display than by legal battles over her estate, by the challenge of determining what happens to great wealth when its owner dies. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Doris Duke divided her time between Rough Point in Newport, Duke Farms in New Jersey, and a Beverly Hills residence, moving seasonally between properties as wealthy Americans had done for generations, following weather and preference across a personal geography mapped in houses and staff and familiar objects. Public glimpses of her in these final years show an older woman still fiercely protective of privacy, still accompanied by staff and companions whose roles blur the already ambiguous lines between employment and intimacy that had characterized her household for decades. In 1988, at age 75, she adopted Chandy Hefner, a woman 45 years her junior, in a legal maneuver that appears designed to create an air outside traditional family structures. 3 years later, she revokes the adoption, a reversal that generates legal battles over money and status, over what was promised and what was owed, over the terms on which people entered and exited her orbit. That same year, she posts $1 million bail for Imelda Marcos, the former First Lady of the Philippines, then facing federal charges in New York, a gesture that demonstrates how Duke's wealth still intersects with global politics, how her money can intervene in matters far beyond personal affairs. On 28 October 1993, Doris Duke died at her Beverly Hills residence, aged 80. The immediate cause, reported in obituaries, is related to declining health in her final year. Obituaries in the New York Times and Los Angeles Times recount her as an elusive, complex figure, tobacco heiress who inherited one of the great American fortunes, art collector who amassed museum-quality holdings across multiple cultures and periods, horticulturalist who created significant gardens, philanthropist whose foundations continue her work, and intensely private individual whose great wealth, as one obituary notes, couldn't buy happiness. Her will, like her father's 7 decades earlier, leaves the bulk of her fortune, estimated at more than $1 billion, to charitable foundations. Legal disputes over its execution followed almost immediately, echoing the battles that surrounded James B. Duke's estate in the 1920s. Former staff members and companions claim they were promised more. Executors disagree about interpretation and intent. Lawyers accumulate billable hours as the machinery of wealth transfer grinds forward. The disputes will take years to resolve, a final irony for someone who spent her life trying to maintain control over her environment and legacy. At Duke Farms in New Jersey, the gardens and conservatories she expanded and maintained became the Duke Farms Foundation, a public environmental center dedicated to sustainability and conservation. Her childhood playground transformed into an educational resource. At Rough Point in Newport, the house remains arranged largely as she left it in 1992, the year before her death. Furniture in place, art on walls, collections displayed as she had curated them, and throughout, spaces for flowers, bowls, vases, containers waiting to be filled with blooms that someone else must now arrange. In death as in life, Doris Duke's story is told through objects and documents, wills and trust agreements that structure foundation work, museum labels that explain provenance and significance, foundation charters that outline philanthropic priorities, photographs that capture her at various ages, always slightly apart from others, always aware of the camera. each document attempts to fix meaning, to say definitively what her life meant and what she valued. None quite resolves the contradictions: immense wealth and persistent loneliness, generosity and control, the desire for privacy and the inescapability of public fascination, the beauty she created, and the questions that remain about what that beauty might have obscured. Today, visitors walking through Rough Point, opened as a museum in 2000 according to provisions in Doris Duke's will, her wish that the house and collections be shared with the public finally overriding her lifetime preference for privacy. See a carefully curated version of her world. The Great Hall displays medieval and Renaissance tapestries alongside Ming Dynasty porcelains, an eclectic mix that reflects her wide-ranging collecting interests. The solarium frames the Atlantic Ocean through tall windows, the view that makes Newport desirable still functioning as it did when the house was built in the 1890s. A portrait of Doris as a child hangs on one wall, painted when she was perhaps 6 or 7, showing her in a white dress with a serious expression, her gaze slightly wary even then, as if already aware that her wealth made her perpetually visible, perpetually observed. Exhibition texts describe her as heiress, collector, and preservationist, outlining her life in the language of accomplishment and taste. For years after the house opened, these texts said little or nothing about Eduardo Tirella, his death and its circumstances existing as an absence in the official narrative, an event that complicated the story of aesthetic achievement and philanthropic vision that the museum sought to tell. Recently, spurred by activism from Tirella's surviving family members and investigative reporting that insists the full story be acknowledged, some tours now mention him, noting his role in shaping Rough Point's collections and the tragedy of his death, though often without delving into the contested details or the unresolved questions about what happened that October afternoon. On certain tours, guides point out what seems at first a simple detail, but reveals itself as characteristic: the abundance of plants and flowers, both inside the house and throughout the grounds. Doris Duke's love of horticulture is everywhere visible: orchids under glass in the solarium, gardens beyond the windows designed with the same attention to detail she brought to interior arrangement, photographs throughout the house showing her tending beds at Duke Farms in Shangri-La, her Hawaii estate, hands in soil, face concentrated on the precise placement of a plant or the adjustment of a stem. The ritual of arranging flowers, which we saw in the opening frame of this documentary, Doris bent over a bowl on 7 October 1966, adjusting stems while a car waited outside and a man prepared to leave forever, has become part of her institutional biography, evidence of refined taste and horticultural knowledge, a feminine accomplishment that fits comfortably within traditional narratives of how wealthy women spent their time and attention. What the museum cannot quite capture, what even the most detailed label text struggles to convey, is the complexity of what that ritual meant: both genuine pleasure and performance, both authentic engagement with beauty and a socially acceptable way to exercise control, both personal expression and the continuation of habits learned in childhood when governesses watched her place flowers in vases for her father's approval. For the visitor, the house operates like a portrait gallery in 3 dimensions. Each room is a frame carefully composed to present a particular image, each object a brushstroke contributing to an overall impression of taste, wealth, and cultivation. The tour moves through space in a choreographed sequence, revealing and concealing according to curatorial choices about what matters, what should be emphasized, what can be safely set aside. Yet, as with any portrait, what is omitted matters as much as what is displayed. The spaces between objects, the stories not told on labels, the questions that at official accounts answered quickly, perhaps too quickly, the life that exists beyond the frame, all of this shadows the visible, shapes the experience of those willing to look past the surface beauty to consider what it might have cost to create and maintain. Our opening image was Doris Duke bent over a bowl of flowers on 7 October 1966, arranging stems with the practiced skill learned over decades, creating beauty with hands trained since childhood to perform this particular domestic art. The documentary might end in the same room decades later, The house now quiet. A museum rather than a home. Staff replaced by docents. Private life converted into public education. A glass vase stands on that same low table by the windows, empty now, waiting for flowers that no one has been assigned to arrange. Light from the Atlantic falls through the tall windows as it has for more than a century. Indifferent to human drama, constant across all the transformations of ownership and purpose. Dust swims in the light where perfume once hung, where the scent of roses and carnations once filled the air. The flowers are gone, no longer freshly cut each week, no longer carefully placed by hands that understood exactly how each stem should angle to create the desired effect. But the space they occupied remains, and with it, the questions their beauty helped obscure. What happened at the gates? What was said in anger or fear? Whether an accident or something else occurred that autumn afternoon when one life ended and another continued, diminished perhaps by doubt, but protected by wealth and the institutional mechanisms that wealth commands. The vase waits, perfectly positioned, holding nothing, revealing everything.